Good timing. We have the last speaker, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chiara Comolli from the University of Lausanne, and I'm presenting a joint work with Bernardi and Marieke Voorpostel, also at the University of Lausanne. Let me start thanking the organizers for this very coherent session, because also the topic of our study is aging and well-being, and I've certainly learned a lot from the previous presentation. So, another introductory small thing. This is a study. This is the first study into this project called Wellbeing, which is a project on how trajectories in family and professional domains influence during the life course well-being and health in Switzerland and France. And this first study sort of comes in a descriptive intent. We want to try to sort of put the basis for the following studies on the development over the life course of well-being and health. And so the relevance of this study and the way we're going to look at this and how well-being and age varies across the life course is, first of all, to have a multidimensional approach to well-being. So you're going to see many different indicators in this study. And what we're also interested in is the heterogeneity across socio-demographic groups in this development over the life course. So I don't want to go too much into the details, because we have heard already presentations on this, but earlier theories on how well-being, and especially subjective well-being, would evolve during the life course basically pointed it to a stable development of well-being despite aging, in a sense. There are many mechanisms and theories that would explain that, going from a sort of genetic predisposition or adaptation over the life course. The problem here is that when we look at studies, that we have seen in the previous presentation, is that most studies actually show that there is no stable subjective well-being over the life course, but mostly a U-shaped form of it, with this minimum between the mid-30s and the early 50s, depending on the studies that point to this midlife crisis. And this, again, there are many explanations for this, namely that young adults have this very high expectations that are not met as they grow, but then there is a sort of adaptation mechanisms, or the fact that only or mostly happy people get to live longer, or, as we have seen in the previous presentation, some depressions or mental health issues that peak in midlife. However, most of this evidence comes from cross-sectional studies, while when we look at more recent studies that have disposed of longitudinal data, then this U-shaped is moderated, or in some cases disappears. And again, this might be due to cohort effects, or the fact that some events that tend to happen in this midlife period are correlated with age, but also with subjective well-being, so that happier people get to marry and get better jobs, etc. Even more recent studies have pointed instead into, they've said that this quadratic term is limiting, in a sense, so that in the end what we observe is this U-shape until a certain point, more or less the age of 60, and then there is a decline where actually we go into the old age. So this U-shaped effect. And this is what we know in terms of the development of well-being, especially of subjective well-being, but also of other dimensions of well-being over the life course in a sort of life course perspective. The other, let's say, main point of this study is how this changes whether we look at different domains of well-being. So, for instance, there were some studies that explained why we see this a steep decline of subjective well-being in young adults, and when you look at satisfaction with leisure or with relationship, when you look at relational well-being, for instance, you see that there is a much steeper decline for young adults. So in a sense, this points us to understand the development of general global subjective well-being over the life course. So we're going to, but we couldn't find, at the best of our knowledge, a comprehensive study that uses many indicators of well-being and health, and this is what we're going to do here. Finally, we know that well-being is unequally distributed in society, and we know that some groups display higher subjective well-being, but also better health than other groups. And here we're focusing on gender and education. And in a sense, what we are interested in is to very descriptively, again, try to test this cumulative disadvantage theory. In a sense, we're looking at whether longitudinal during the life course, these inequalities, if they exist, how they evolve with age. So we're doing this, we're looking at Switzerland. We're using the Swiss household panel, which is a very long longitudinal sample of households in Switzerland. We're looking only at individuals who personally participated and answered the questions. Just to reduce the number of missing data, I'm running separate analysis for subjective well-being measures and health. And this subjective well-being measures, you find a long list here. We selected a few. We have more in the sample. We're basically looking at general life satisfaction, relational well-being, financial well-being, satisfaction with health, and some measures of satisfaction with work or household measures in a sense of satisfaction with the housework division, etc. And then we also picked only 6 indicators of health. Again, we have more. The idea here is to have a sort of 3 subjective measures, so self-rated health, optimism and depression, and some more objective measures of headaches, weaknesses, and sleep disorders. Now here it gets tricky given the presentation before, but what we are using here in the models is categories of 5 years of age, and we have some controls for marital status, employment, number of children, nationality, birth cohort, and household income. They're in gray because the model is a fixed effect model, so of course in the model this controls disappear, and I think in the discussion we can discuss whether these are appropriate controls for what we want to estimate or not. So what I'm going to show you first is very rapidly what happens when we compare cross-sectional to fixed effect estimates on these domains, and then I'm going to show you the fixed effect models by gender and education to see whether we see these inequalities unfolding over time. Here I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs like this. I hope that the screen is big enough that you can read. Anyway, this is subjective well-being, the 8 measures that we have. We have age categories, and this is the predicted satisfaction in the specific domain. You have general life satisfaction in the first graphs here, and in this case we have men on the left and women on the right. And here I just wanted to point you, in line with the presentations before, is that when you move from the blue line, that's the cross-sectional estimates, to the fixed effect estimate, the U shape of life satisfaction is moderated, and we tend to see this wave shape. It doesn't disappear in this data, and also it's not super significant, this decline after 60, but we do see it. While we do not see the same things in other indicators. So for instance, in terms of financial well-being, we see that looking at cross-sectional or fixed effect estimates doesn't really change, or that the satisfaction with health instead, once we look within individual, it really declines over the life course. Women only have smaller differences, but they show the same thing. Here is health, and we see that, of course, once we look at fixed effect within individual estimates, we get rid of a bit of this selection into older ages, so people who get there, they sort of tend to report better health. In terms of gender differences, here you have only fixed effect estimates comparing men and women. And again, in line with previous studies, we don't find gender differences in general life satisfaction. We also, I think, we can say that we don't really see this cumulative disadvantage over the life course. We only see divergent satisfaction among men and women in the living together, satisfaction with the living together domain. All the others tend to differ more into the childbearing age, in a sense, but not in the direction we would expect. So that, for instance, women tend to have a higher job satisfaction. And this has been found in other studies before. Similarly, in health, we only see divergence, so increasing differences over the life course when we look at sleep disorders, not in other measures. And finally, in terms of education, the confidence intervals become a bit bigger now, especially in the low educated group, that is the blue line, because the number gets a bit small. But again, here I would say we don't really see this cumulative disadvantage process going on in the life course. We see some persistency of disadvantage, for instance, in terms of financial well-being for the lower educated, which persists, starts quite early in the 30s and persists over the life course. And in terms of health, the same, we see some disadvantages, and maybe here we see some accumulation in terms of self-rated health, but not a strong evidence, I would say, in terms of this accumulation of disadvantages. And so just to sum up and conclude, I think we can say that the U shape gets less pronounced but doesn't disappear when we look at within individual instead of comparing between individuals or in the cross-sectional estimates. But it remains remains strong in some specific domains, and especially for men compared to women. We don't see much divergence over the life course, neither across gender or education, at least in the case of Switzerland. So thank you very much, and if you want to know more about the project, you can write me or just visit the website. Thank you very much.